you all for coming out or in on this beautiful late summer, early fall day to learn about our recently published book, From the Hudson to the Taconics, and to look at the landscape here in Austerlitz a little bit through the eyes of habitats. As you have noticed, there will be two presenters today. I will give you an introduction to what we understand with the term habitat. I'll show you a little bit how we made the field guide and how it's structured, and that it's not as intimidating as it might look when you open it up. And introduce you just briefly to a few of the habitats that we have right here behind the church and some of the plants that one can actually find there. And then Conrad will do a deep dive into some of the things that he's learned about the history of land use in the Austerlitz area. So I hope you'll enjoy it. And before I start with the presentation, I want to just briefly introduce our program. The Hudson Valley Farmscape Ecology program has been around for more than 20 years now. And it's a small research and outreach program dedicated to helping people connect more to the land in Columbia County. We do original research into the distribution of plants and animals in our landscape. We take people out and show them what we see and learn together. We do also a lot of research into how agriculture and wild nature interact. And if you're interested in hearing more from us and coming on walks with us, please make sure to sign up. The sign-up sheet in the back there, it will give you once a month an email with the programming that we're offering. And of course, the books are also for sale in the back there if you're interested afterwards. Whoops, okay, let's get accustomed to the clicker again. Here. So we define as a habitat as a particular consistent category of land or water that seems to be identifiable on its physical conditions and the organisms it supports. So it's a community. And determining a habitat is sort of like finding an entry in an index in a book or a search term in Google. It's your opening to a whole set of knowledge. Once you know which habitat you're in, you can learn a lot about that place. And this is just to illustrate some of the habitats that we chose to highlight in the field guide. And while it is easy to distinguish an old field from a northern hardwood forest, it's sometimes a little bit trickier to distinguish an old field from a dry meadow or a northern hardwood forest from an oak maple forest. As we say in the field guide, identifying habitats is more like parsing a color spectrum than trying to identify distinct shapes. And sometimes we're used to using field guides to identify birds or flowers, and once you know what characteristics to look for, it's relatively straightforward to identify species. With habitats, it tends to be a little bit more complicated. Habitats grade into each other. Sometimes the boundaries are not so clear. So if you're used to using field guides to identify species, a field guide to habitat can be sometimes a little bit less satisfying. And so why even try if those boundaries are sometimes not so clear? Well, one reason to try is that it really disciplines you to look closer and to make observations in nature that you might not have made otherwise, and to build your own questions and start observing your own things and build on the knowledge that we're providing in the field guide. So don't take the field guide as the final word forever. Take it as a starting point for an exploration of nature around you. And do remember, as I mentioned, habitats can grade into each other spatially, but they can also transition over time from one into the other, like this example of the transition of a former conifer plantation that's slowly turning into a young hardwood forest. And do remember, there are places out in nature that stubbornly define getting pigeonholed into any of our categories. And then it's okay to say, well, it looks like a young hardwood forest, but it has elements of a dry oak forest, and it's okay. It's okay not to come down with one particular thing, but it's still defines a little bit the general area that you're looking at, and then you can go into the chapters and see which plants and animals you can expect in those habitats. The goal for that field guide was to provide a tool for building human connection with the landscape, and through that connection, an informed reverence for the landscape and for all of its inhabitants. There were 4 authors working together on this, but there was a whole community of support for our co-workers. We had interns and volunteers, and we worked on this book for more than 12 years. So a lot of people have contributed to this over time. How did we go about doing it? Well, for a couple of years, 2012, 13, and 14, we sampled 500 different locations all throughout Columbia County, so each of those dots was one of our sample locations. And for the ecological characteristics. So we wrote down all the plants that we could see there, we inventoried for insects, and we also took notes on birds and reptiles and amphibians and mammals, but not as detailed because they were very brief visits to each of those sites. We maybe spent 2 hours, not like a whole day. But we chose the sites to represent really the cross-section of conditions that we find in Columbia County. And for that we had subdivided the county into 10 ecoregions, and then made sure that within each ecoregion we sampled as many habitats as we could get access to. And then our colleague Anna, she's actually, that's her, she's a cultural anthropologist, and she parallelly conducted research to answer 2 questions. One was, what parts of the landscape are particularly special or important to people? And the other one, how do people perceive, describe, and interact with different parts of the landscape? And she did that with recreation area surveys, habitat focus groups, photo scavenger hunts. She did interviews and walks with people with specific land use knowledge and experience. And she invited children and adults to share their special places in nature. And her insights into how people perceive and interact with the land is also included in the book. So then, after all this field research and then several years of data crunching and analysis, we decided, okay, we're going to include 32 habitats in the field guide, and they are grouped by upland forest habitats, open upland habitats, wetlands, and water bodies. And each of those habitats is structured in a very predictable way, so once you get used to the field guide, it's really easy to find the information you're looking for. Each of those 32 habitat chapters has a title page that gives what we consider a typical image of what the habitat looks like when you walk into it. And then the second page, well, actually all the following pages are color-coded with this bar up here that corresponds to the group of habitats that you're in. So the dry oak forest is an example of the upland forests. If this were a wetland, you would have this color on the bar up there. And then this first paragraph is sort of our distillation of what we found most noteworthy about the habitat. And then the first glimpse is an invitation to walk right into the habitat and learn how it feels to be in there. Sometimes we even describe what you might hear or how it smells. So very sense-oriented, non-scientific, just come walk into it with us. This is how we felt when we were there. And then it becomes a little bit more scientific. We describe where the habitat occurs in Columbia County. So the green shading is generally where you can find it, and then those numbered dots are public areas where you can actually go and experience this habitat. And then we have what we call a dashboard of vital statistics of the habitat. And this is as scientific as it gets, so just bear with me. We have one chart here that's a synecological chart, where the habitat is highlighted in comparison to all the other habitats within its group. So these could be all the upland forests, and that's the dry oak forest. And it shows where it sits on a gradient between dry and wet soil, and nutrient poor and nutrient rich soil. And that's just developed out of the composition of the plants that we found. We've located them in this chart. Then we also have a bar of the average number of native species and the average number of non-native species that we found in our examples of this habitat. And for our purposes, native species are defined as species that were either present in the Hudson Valley before European colonization, or they arrived more recently through dispersal processes not directly facilitated by people. And then finally we have this bar down here that's just showing the relative abundance of invasive plants. And the invasive species are defined as non-native species that can cause environmental or economic harm in a certain region. And Columbia County belongs to the capital region, and the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management basically draws up a list of the species that are considered invasive in our region, and we just took that. So that's all that. And then we go back to our chapter. The next few pages are dedicated to what to look for in the habitat. And it's organized by plants, birds and mammals, amphibians and reptiles, and insects. And we just highlight the critters that we found most typical or most exceptional or just noteworthy. We also have always a little table of the characteristic plants in the habitat and a table of species of conservation concern. So those are species that we either know are declining or they are rare to start with at different geographic scales. So some of them are rare or declining throughout the United States, and some of them are just within Columbia County, rare or declining. Then we have a little paragraph on similar habitats and variation within the habitat. So that's where we're trying to contrast it to other habitats that you might easily confuse it with, and how to try to distinguish them. Our thoughts on stewardship. And then each chapter has a one-page dive into the history that Conrad wrote, where he just shows one component of the history that drew his attention of a particular habitat, and gives a little bit more information about that. And then Anna's sections were the perspectives, where she summarized what she has learned with her research from all the different people she spoke with, how people are perceiving the habitat. And then she also put together one page with an invitation to interact with the habitat. Just little exercises of what one can do when one finds oneself in the habitat to get to know it better and become more familiar. So once you're familiar with the structure of those habitat chapters, you can expect 32 habitats that are all structured in the same predictable way, and it should be easy for you to find the information. And then there are a few chapters that break the mold. We have Hudson River habitats, which are 4 groups of habitats that only occur along the Hudson River, and we describe those in a somewhat different format. And then we also have a chapter on ghost habitats that reminds us that we know of habitats that used to be here that we no longer find. And it also reminds us that the habitats that we might be seeing now might not be here anymore in 20, 50, 100 years. So this book is basically sort of a cross-section of what is here right now, but don't expect this to be valid for forever. It will change, and hopefully it will be a tool for people to realize changes and say, hey, wait, they're talking about hemlock forest, where are the hemlocks? And so it'll be an invitation again to learn more and make your own observations. And then in the back of the book, we have a table that compares our habitat classification with other classifications that have been applied in our region. So again, it gets a little bit more scientific for those of you so inclined. But let me just briefly talk about how we are hoping that you will use this book, and there are many different ways how you can use it and find it helpful. Some of you might actually sit down and read the thing from cover to cover, and I hope some of you will. But if you're not so sure you want to do that, let's see. I would recommend start with the preface. Conrad wrote a beautiful preface that's really inviting and hopefully will draw you in. There are also some brief introductory chapters that sort of give an overview, a bird's eye view of Columbia County and the geology, the settlement history, and issues of conservation and biodiversity. So those are good entry points. And then there's also, to each of the 4 habitat groups, we have little introductory chapters that give definitions and classifications, talk about the importance for biodiversity, the value in the landscape, and human use and impact of each of these groups, the upland forests, open uplands, wetlands, and water bodies. And they also give a few definitions that you will find helpful when reading the actual chapters. If you're not sure you want to read it all, just look at the pictures. They're gorgeous. They were all taken in Columbia County, most of them by our team. And then there are a few that people have contributed, but it's just an amazing cross-section of all the life that's out there in the landscape with us. And then another way of using this book, you can jump right to the very back page where we have this map of public areas in Columbia County and an accompanying table that has the public areas in the columns, and in the rows it has the different habitats. And you can see which habitats you can expect to find in a particular public area. So you can say, for example, I would like to see a swamp forest. Where can I go to see a swamp forest? And you go over here and you go up. You can go to Art Oma. You can go to, oh my goodness, I can't even read it. But yeah, you get the idea. so we hope you will use the field guide like that as well. And then if you're brave and carry the heavy thing out into the field, you can actually use it to try to figure out where you are. So find a habitat that you're curious about. Look at our habitats at a glance chart and make a first guess where you might be finding yourself. Read the first glimpse. If it still seems reasonable, read the similar habitats. If it still seems reasonable, start looking what to look for, what we suggest. Look for the characteristic plants if you can actually find them. And work your way through. If you're lucky, you hit it right off and you learn about the habitats in one circle through. If at any one point it doesn't seem to make sense anymore and you go like, no, they're saying this here, but I'm seeing something very different, go back to the habitats at a glance and try again. So it's this iterative process of trying to hone in. And really, don't make it so much about trying to get it right, but make it about, okay, in what way can I look at the land here, and what could I be looking for, and what are some of the questions that I'm coming up with, and the observations that I can make, and have fun. Conrad says, bring a friend, make it a community event. So, yeah, and before I pass it over to Conrad, I want to invite you after the talk, if you're still up for it, we will just go actually behind Will's house. We will go into that hayfield, old field, wetland area and explore a little bit the variety of habitats that's there on a very small, actually, parcel. And we will walk right into the unmowed area and try to see, so are we in an old field? Are we in a wet meadow? How can we figure this out? And we will look at some of the old field goldenrods. You might not realize we have 15 different types of goldenrods in Columbia County. Now 4 of them are very common in old fields. And if you come on the walk, I'll show you how to distinguish them. And then we will also look at some of the wetland indicators. So these pictures were all taken 2 weeks ago back there. So one can get to see purple loosestrife and the similar looking blue vervain. This one is a non-native invasive species. This one is a invasive wetland, a native wetland plant. There's purple-stemmed aster. It was just starting to flower 2 weeks ago, so I think it will go in full tilt now. There's some turtlehead hiding in there, and we will see some of the other wetland indicators like the soft rush. And then if one is really brave, one can go even further in and find this marshy area, a shrub swamp, and one can poke one's head down into the Green River and see the beaver dam that's there, that's actually causing some of those habitats because they're raising the water level. Yeah, so that's all I had, and I'll pass it on to Conrad. And we'll do questions at the end altogether.
Well, and if you have any questions for me, just feel free to indicate. Sure, I don't mind stopping. This is a little bit of an adventure for me because like about 2 hours ago I realized that part of my slides had disappeared. So I think they're all back, but we'll find out. Mainly the tack I'm going to take is talking about history, sort of thinking about old fields, where do they come from, where might they be going, that sort of thing. A little bit on old field ecology, a bit on history, more old field ecology, more history, a bit on people, and then a little bit about the future. So starting with that old field ecology. So one of the things, to think about, and I think probably you all know this, is just that old fields are really the stage in a longer transition. So you have something like you have agriculture that gets abandoned, and then the land starts to evolve, the communities start to change. Somewhere in here is what we call old field. So it's not, it's just a pause or just a moment in a larger trajectory. And this is probably as scientific as I'm going to get, but this is just to sort of bring this point home that where we are here, we don't naturally have a field state. So what this shows, this is mean annual temperature. This is mean annual precipitation. Each of these little gray dots is one place in the United States, actually in the world. People went through and they made up this huge data set where they went to all these different places in the world, looked at mean precipitation, mean annual temperature, and then they said, is it desert? Is it grassland? Is it forest? That sort of thing. So we're sort of located right in here. We're given our temperature and given our annual precipitation, we're naturally in forest. If we were a bit drier or a bit hotter, we'd end up in grassland. But that's why old field is not an end point. It's, as I said, a stop in it or a pause in a continuum, because in our landscape, we end up in forest. Does that make sense, basically? And, as you think about this across the scale of the whole United States, we're up in here, well placed in forest. All the green here is forest. The brown is various grasslands, the prairies, where it's hotter, drier. So the end point there naturally is some sort of grassland vegetation. And here you get into desert and some more montane vegetation. But again, just indicating that, we're not here. This is a photo I took out in North Dakota, I think. This is prairie. You let this go, it will stay prairie. I mean, sometimes you have to burn it in some cases, but that's kind of their endpoint, whereas here, it's not our endpoint. Now, there are different kinds of, if we talk about abandoned field, we talk more broadly and not just say old field. So if you look at various abandoned crop fields, depending on the conditions, you might go to a wet meadow and then on to something like a red maple swamp. You might, in sort of these medium moist conditions, you go to what we call in the field guide an old field, go to northern hardwoods. Dry, hilly situations, you'd go to a dry meadow, and then maybe oak, hickory, or pine. So again, just, these evolutions or these, trajectories of habitat differ depending on where you are on the landscape. Does that make sense? Not sure if you're nodding just because you want to make me feel good or So a little bit about history. This it's not as complicated as it looks. So here's year, starting about 1600, you got 2000 over here. And this is percent of the state, of a given state that's in the forest. So if you look at, for example, I think this is Delaware, this pink line with square dots. It starts out almost more than 90% forested. By the mid-1800s, you're down to about 40% or 30% actually forested. Why is that? What was happening?
Agriculture.
Yeah, agriculture. Delaware actually continues. It doesn't rebound very much, but most states actually bounce back up again. So New York is green, has a real lull in the mid-1800s, and then goes back up again. And this era, when you're going from being wide open agricultural area back into forest, well, there are transition stages. As you go from wide open field back into forest, you go through what? Old field. Because something's abandoned, it starts to grow up, you have old field, you have shrubland, and then you're back into forest. So really the heyday, no pun intended, of old field is this sort of era when things are growing back. Because once you're back up to a full forest, you don't actually have much reason to have old field. There's not much disturbance going on. You have some. It's not that there's none. But it was really this era when a lot of agriculture was being abandoned was the era in which you had a lot of old field. Make sense? Mm-hmm. This is the same sort of diagram, but this is for Columbia County. So we went back to the census records and all that. This is the percent of Columbia County that's in a given type of habitat. This again is year. So improved farmland, which would be basically its field. It's crops, it's hay field, it's pasture, that sort of thing. It really peaked sort of here 1860, 1870. So that's, when they talk about the landscape being wide open. We have a picture of our house in Chatham, actually from a little bit later. But you could see all the way from the top of a hill where we are, all the way across to the Taconic, several miles away because the landscape was so open. Conversely, forest took a nosedive. We were probably somewhere 20 to 30% forested in the 1860s, 1870s. Now we're back up to 60 or 70% forested. But again, the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's this era in here when you're going through the transition that would be the era for old field. Is that, any questions? No? I just wanted to share. Yeah.
Why are you concentrating on old field? What does that mean to you?
It's the habitat that we're going to visit.
Okay, so you're just focusing on it.
Yeah, it was just one. I just became obsessed with old field. It was the one that and because I talk about the history, it was just one that has a lot of history associated with it. Yeah, so that's, yeah.
So before it was field, it was forest.
Forest, yeah.
And so they would just clear out every tree for miles and miles, dig out the root systems, etc., build houses, make fields.
Basically. They didn't always, sometimes they would let the roots rot. It depended on how intensive they were being. But you go up, where the BB Hill Fire Tower is? Yeah. You walk up there and you realize you're walking by stone walls in the middle of the forest. Yeah. Because it was really the frontier, in the mid-1700s when people were coming in from New England, wasn't that far west. So they were getting pushed out of New England, but they were sort of bumping up against the frontier. And so they were settling areas that really, we wouldn't think about it as agricultural areas today, but they would go in there and they would cut the trees down. Maybe sometimes they would farm around the roots, sometimes they take, depending on how intensive they would be. Yeah?
Have land use laws affected the march of the forest, or are they preferring open areas for residential use? Are they preferring farmland? And does it vary within the county which towns want to do what? Or is that this is more of a global look as opposed to
So sort of laws like zoning
Right.
and things like that.
Land use, land.
Yeah, I think it very much does, because it's so town-based, I think it does vary. And some towns have more interest in their farmland than other towns, and some have more history of it. I mean, yeah, the hills of Austerlitz weren't necessarily prime farmland, whereas Stuyvesant maybe was more. So I think it does depend on the town.
I was just thinking how that overlay affects those lovely up and down charts you have. Because for a while there weren't land use laws, that everybody just did willy-nilly. They owned the land, they did what they wanted.
Yeah, I don't think, those charts, something like that, the main thing you're seeing here is not the effect of laws. The main thing that you're seeing...
Because they hadn't been considered important until like the late...
It was
part of
just,
the chart.
relative to the main pressure here, or the main force here, it was just, even if there were laws, they had minimal effect.
Right.
Because what was happening was, well, you tell me. What was happening here? Why did agriculture drop off so much in the...
Easier to farm elsewhere.
Yeah, easier to farm elsewhere. You have the Erie Canal opens up, then you get railways, and then you're into the prairie soils. So it didn't pay. And so that was the main reason you see this decline in farmland. And the rise of forests was largely incidental. There were efforts, as you know, if you go around the county, you find conifer plantations. The state did say, oh, we have all this abandoned farmland, we better do something with it, let's try to plant some conifer plantations. But it wasn't at the scale that accounts for this. This is mainly just abandonment.
Nature moving on.
Yeah. Makes sense? Any other questions?
Hey, Conrad.
Yeah, what?
When the forest returns, the upward slope of that, is that forest the same as what it was there before, or is it fundamentally changed?
That's a very good question. Claudia and I are both snickering because we have a project looking at that right now. So it's probably somewhat different. And what we talk about is post-agricultural forests versus what we call ancient forests. Now, an ancient forest it's not the same as old growth. Old growth means basically people have never been in there, you have all the old vegetation, you have all the old trees and that sort of thing. In our definition, ancient forest means it's an area that was never completely open for agriculture. It may be an old woodlot, and people have gone in and taken some trees out, but they never completely converted it to agriculture. Mm-hmm. And we think that there are differences in the soil life, the herbaceous plant life, perhaps the insect life. So we have a colleague who's looking at mushrooms, for example, between ancient forest and paired post-agricultural forest. We also have a colleague who studies ants, who's doing the same comparison. We have another colleague who's actually going to look at earthworms. And then we also looked at the spring wildflowers. So we don't quite have the final answer yet. You can stay tuned. Maybe in 3 years we'll come back and we can, maybe 5 years.
Well, and we know in terms of the trees, so if you find a lot of hemlocks that are mature, if you find American beech, if you find basswood, if you find yellow birch, those are usually trees in our area that don't come back into former fields for 100 or 200 years. And so if we find them as big trees in the forest now, it's a pretty good indication that that forest was not cleared for agriculture.
Oh, yeah, so I just wanted to give you kind of more of a visceral feel for this. Have any of you seen the Harvard Forest dioramas? Yeah, they're kind of amazing, aren't they? Yeah, they've got this room, this is probably almost life-size. I mean, they're pretty big, they're big. And they have them all around this dark room. They were made, I think, in the 1920s, 1930s, somewhere in there. it's a little bit hard to tell, but this is actually diorama. So these trees in the front are models, and then there's a painted background. But then what they did is they made a series of dioramas around changes in the landscape. So this was their visualization of primeval forest, you might say. And then you have the initial opening up of the land. In our area, maybe late 1700s, something like that. People coming in, cutting down the forest, starting to try to make a go of it. And of course, I should say, in this, there would have been indigenous people. Now, how many, where they were, what they were doing, it's hard to know in our area, but they were certainly present. And then you have the European colonists coming in, starting to open up the land more. And then you get, this would be considered like the height of agriculture. So in our area, maybe 1850, 1860, this is when you can, stand on one hill and look into the far horizon. Not much forest around. Probably not much old field either. There might have been a little bit of old field right there along the roads. That's because that was the area that was kind of like, yeah, okay, our horse grazed on it, but so this may have been sort of old fieldy. This would have been pasture, it's cultivated. And then as you move on, we start to get into the abandonment era. People have gone west. You would get old field developing. This is sort of maybe a type of old field, shrubiness here. And then this is a little bit later. You're getting the saplings growing up. There's patches of old field. There's the chimney of that house. It's sort of dwindling away. And then, you get the young forest, and you get the somewhat older forest. But again, I sort of put that in there because the old field that we're talking about was really just on a couple of these slides. It was again just a pause in a way. So this is another diorama. But they did a really nice job of this. It's sort of, you want to go and visit this actual landscape. There's an old apple orchard here. This again, I've gone back in time. This is the era of abandonment when you would have had the old fields in there. Just to give you a little bit of a feel for that. Now, I want to bring this home a little bit. We are now, I believe, right up in here. So this is Austerlitz, 1942. And I want you to think, one thing is think about where on an image like this you would find old field. So we're at 1942, it's certainly, we're well into the era of abandonment. Where do you see traces of agriculture on this? I mean, there's active agriculture, but where do you see areas that might be an old field?
Edges?
Edges? Somebody say edges?
Edges, yeah.
Sort of around maybe here. You see some traces of old field over here. These are actually walls through here, and you see these are going back down in here. You see again these traces of old, for example, and there are other places in here, but you can see the stone walls through here, and these are our old former farm fields. But what I want to do is I'm going to go through a series. I have an image like this for just about every decade up to the present. And it's the same area, so this is the quiz. What I'm going to ask you to do is actually look at those, and at the end I'm going to ask you what has changed. What has changed in that picture?
Before you move on, can you give us a little orientation?
Sure.
I live here and I'm having a hard time.
Yep. So the junction of 22 and 203 is right about up here.
Okay, all right.
This is 22 coming down.
Yeah.
I think we are actually right here right now.
So where would Harvey Mountain Road be?
Right south of
Harvey Mountain Road. I think
that's the hill.
Here. Is this it?
Yeah.
That's it.
I guess the post office would be in there. Yep.
And what's the road on the left?
Somebody else tell me which
West
one.
Hill.
West Hill Road.
West Hill. Okay. Yeah, I don't know all the road names. And here's the Green River.
Thank you. Where's the green?
This is the Green River right there.
Cool.
Okay. So I'm going to go through these. I already did that one, but so that's 1942. That's 1952. 1960, sorry, 1960 was a blurry year. It's just, oh, I actually made a mistake on that. This is, yeah, anyway. 1971. There's 1980. 1995. All of a sudden you started getting a little bit of color in the landscape. Don't worry about it. Just when the 2006, 2017, and today. I'll just run through those quickly again. All the way to the back. Forget 1960, I made a mistake. 42, 52, 71, 80, 95, 2006, 2017, and the present. So what's changed?
Seems like a big drop in the 70s and 80s.
Lots of trees.
Sorry, somebody?
A lot more forest.
Okay, a lot more forest. That's, what else?
Is that water?
This is water.
Puddles?
These are all,
Oh,
yeah,
man-made?
yes. So this is what we call the result of the pond boom. And I'm not kidding. I mean, if you look at the number of ponds in Columbia County and how it has increased in the past, say, 4 decades, it's tremendous, huge. What else do you notice? It's a little
More roads. Additional.
more roads, yeah. More roads, more houses. So, actually quite a lot of changes, not so much, and if you go back, to return to our theme of old fields, lots of old field here, all around, there would be lots of opportunity. You get all the way up to the present, blah, 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 blah. Less opportunity for old field, right? So, yeah, I just had what's changed, more forest, more, it's harder to tell here, but those houses are actually higher. So if you look at the mean altitude of houses in like 1940 and today, the mean altitude is a lot higher because now you can put in wells, that go down 400 feet. You don't have to dig them by hand. You can have driveways and, and more roads, more ponds. And I just wanted to, this actually isn't Austerlitz, this is Hillsdale. But I wanted to just, when you think about this image, and you say, oh, there's lots of forest, realize that, and this looks like it's lots of forest, but if you start looking at what is actually the sphere of influence of each of these, each of these is a house, here's the road, everybody's got pets, they've got lights, the cars are driving up and down the driveway. So you have this sphere of impact on the surroundings that makes this forest look a lot more like ecological Swiss cheese. Does that make sense? I just wanted to sort of pass that along. Okay, a bit more on old field ecology. Do all old fields become forests? I'm sure this has been keeping you up at night. But it's, I told you that they were stages in a transition. And yet, any of you know Michael Kudish? Have you ever heard of him? He's actually, you should look him up. He's a botanist. He worked in the Adirondacks, and now he's over in the Catskills. He wrote a really interesting book. I think it's called Catskill Forests, which is an ecological history of the Catskills, essentially. So really knowledgeable guy, really nice guy. And he published this paper entitled, "Not All Abandoned Pastures Become Forest!" Exclamation point. Well, there isn't one, but and the point he was making is that. Did you have a question?
Well, an observation that the plants are opportunistic, and what's going to come, whether it's a tree or a shrub or whatever, is very much an opportunistic competition in the vegetation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and the usual way that that's thought of is you have an open crop field, and what comes first are the herbaceous plants, the grasses and things like that. And then you start getting some of the shrubs come in and some of the trees, and they start shading out the the more herbaceous vegetation. And so that's why in general you have this trend from herbaceous to woody. But he was making the point that there are actually some places he knows in the Catskills that have been in goldenrod since he can't remember when, and nobody, as far as he knows, has ever cut them, or has not cut them since they went into goldenrod, I should say. So he's sort of trying to make the point that if you get something that's really thick enough, perhaps under some conditions, you just get a semi-permanent old field situation. Now that's kind of more of a guess or a proposal than it is completely documented. But we have this little, and Claudia would be glad to tell you more about this, but this is we have some test plots down near Kingston. Have any of you ever heard of the Farm Hub? It's an experimental farm outside of Kingston. And what Claudia did is, 8 years ago now, we set up these half-acre plots where we planted wildflowers, we planted native grasses, and then we just had a fallow. We just said, okay, come what may, whoever wants to come, botanical-wise. And they get cut once a year. But what we've noticed is, here is one of those plots where you have a lot of cottonwood coming in. It's been treated the same way as the plot next door, but this is grass. And those grasses do a great job. You have a couple around the edges, but do a great job of keeping out the cottonwood. So we don't know what would happen if we just walked away from these, but certainly our guess was this would be soon a cottonwood forest. This might stay in grasses for a longer period of time. Again, it's this, do all old fields end up as forest? Maybe eventually, but certainly it's not all in the same time trajectory.
Yeah. How long do cotton seeds, how long could they possibly last and still produce a tree?
Well, what happens here is these get cut annually, but that doesn't kill the roots. So we have, this is 1 year of growth. These will grow up to like 8 feet in a year. We cut them back, those roots are still alive, they come up again even stronger the next year. So and then you have cottonwood all in I can't point it out, but you're all sitting in the swamp forest, in the riverside forest, floodplain forest, where all the cottonwood are. So these seeds come in every year from the big cottonwoods that are nearby. Can't establish themselves in here. They may, I think almost all of this is now root regrowth as opposed to seeding. So I didn't answer your question. I don't know how long one cottonwood seed would stay on its, stay viable in the soil.
But for a while around here, the white, not the maple, the other one they make baseball, that's out of
Ash.
Yeah, there weren't too many of them. And then suddenly they seem to be sprouting all over the place. And I can only believe that these seeds must remain viable for maybe 10, 20, 30 years or more.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a combination. I don't know what do you know what the soil, but it's also, you have some in the landscape and then something changes. You have an opening, like maybe you have Dutch elm disease come in and takes a lot of the elm out of certain areas. You've got openings, and the few ash that are there all of a sudden find, we can settle here. We can now move in. So sometimes it's that you have this seed source out there all the time, but it just can't take root literally, and then something changes in the landscape, or as you said, you suddenly open it up and you've got a seed bank. So I think it can be both.
And you get the emerald ash borer.
Yeah, and then you have the emerald ash borer, so a lot of the ashes are not dying. Okay. So permanent old fields, some might be relatively self-sustaining, but the thing is, you kind of have to shepherd them to get there. Claudia, we were talking about this yesterday. If you leave an agricultural field, it doesn't automatically go to goldenrod. It goes to grasses, goes to some of the old field weeds, and and if you just let it go, don't touch it, it may quickly go into brambles and then on into trees or what have you. But if you start mowing it every year, then it seems that favors the goldenrod. The goldenrod get established, they really get their roots down, then they can hold things out. So it's this, yes, maybe they're semi-permanent, but they have to kind of get there. Here's another question that I'm sure has been worrying you. Are all old fields the same? And I showed you this diagram before where I really, instead of saying old field, I said abandoned field. You know, if wet conditions, you go to a certain type of wet meadow, you go to old field, you go. So there's not all open land ends up in the same place. And to make that point, how many of you have seen the meadows up at Steepletop? Okay, fair number. So those are actually they're intriguing meadows. I'm talking about the one up above the house there, which is where this photograph was taken. You know, those have been old fields since St. Vincent Millay's day, because I think they would get cut for hay maybe, or they would get cut to keep open. But what's incredible is if you go in there and you start looking, there are some really interesting old plants. Anybody recognize that one? It's actually wood lily. It's one of our native lilies. You know, you don't really think of them as garden plants, lilies as garden plants. This is one that you really just find out in the wild in some areas. This is the slender lobelia, right? Yeah. Slender lobelia, which is up there. Oh, I pushed it off the eye. This is the closed gentian. And this is what species of orchid is that?
I think it's flower.
Okay, there's a scientific name for this one.
Yeah.
But this is one of our native orchids.
I think it's called green tubercled orchid. That's
So, yeah, we actually, how many native orchids do we have in Claudia County? Roughly.
Theoretically around 20, but most of them you don't see anymore.
So we have around 20 species of native. You don't usually think of orchids being a native plant in the Northeast, but we have quite a few of them. Yeah. But anyway, the point was, you know, something about the conditions here have made this,
Well, she was quite an amateur botanist herself. And I mean, she probably didn't intend for all this to happen, but she would have noticed, I think.
I hope so. Yeah, I don't know that I've seen her. I'm not sure if I've seen botanical journals from her, but there may be some things in her diaries or something.
Yeah, well, there is a document. She was into mushrooms too, and she identified a mushroom and described it to the state authorities, wondering if it was edible, and the advice came back, maybe it is, but
I was just bringing this up as I won't go into a whole lot of detail here, but just that for some reason, you know, some of these old fields aren't just in goldenrod, but they're in some of these other types of plants. And this is all in the same field. I didn't show you pictures, but I study butterflies more than I study plants. There are some interesting butterflies in this field. Yeah, and that's actually the field out here. It's a bit different. The past yet again. So some of the various things that determine how an old field develops, the soils, how it was managed, what it was in before it became old field. And as we're going to walk out to the old field here, and I just wanted to show you some of the images. This is the old field that we're going to walk out to. So we're right here right now. But this is the CLC property. You all know where that is? It's just down the road a couple of jumps.
Behind Will's house.
Behind Will's house. Will's house would be right in here. Right?
Yeah, right next to the cemetery.
Yeah. So you can see in 1942, most of this area was being kept open. This is probably even cultivated, some of it, and you have some hay maybe. You get up to 1971, probably all hay, and then 2006, it's being kept open, and then this was just the cut that CLC did this year to keep it open. But again, depending on what you're coming, and I'm just trying to help you think a little bit about the little different factors in history, depending on how you managed it at these different stages, would determine some of the botany. Yeah.
A little extra square's my barn.
Did you just put a new roof on it?
Now, I wanted to ask you too, you mentioned that there's a lot of ponds now,
Yeah.
and they become ecological factors. But we also have, and it's not shown on the map, but two, you would almost call them lakes. One is up the hill that way, the other one is up the hill that way. And they hold a lot of water. Does that affect the Green River, for instance?
You know, I think this whole pond boom, and if you're interested in this, I have a short article on it. I think it could. I mean, you're getting more evapotranspiration. The other thing you're doing is you're getting more warming of the water. So we sort of think of, oh, you've got a pond here and you've got the stream here and never the twain shall meet. But actually there's often a water connection either underground or sometimes they overflow. And so if you have all these open areas that are exposed to the sun, you're probably warming up the temperature of the stream, which then in turn could affect things like trout breeding and that sort of thing. So I don't know the degree to which this has actually been documented, but I think you can easily imagine how it might be happening. Makes sense? Okay, I'm getting there. People now and then. So Claudia mentioned that Anna did bits on the perspective, Anna, our colleague, looked at how different people look at the landscape. So this is actually the page out of the old field section. And we're all going to read this together. Are you ready? Just talking about how different people perceive the environment. So she would take people who were just volunteered to come with her and go into an old field and sort of say, what do you think? How do you like it? And so she says, some people here got all happy and others said, it's kind of prickly. I don't really like going in here. I like to look at it from a distance maybe. So different people had, different views on this. She also gave people a camera and said, all right, go take a picture of any place in Columbia County that you think is representative of the ecology of Columbia County. And many people came back with old field pictures. Old fields don't actually take up all that much space in Columbia County, but obviously for a lot of people, it's sort of one of the impressions that they have of what is a key ingredient of Columbia County is old fields. So again, in the book you can read more about, and she talked to trappers and hunters, and it's really quite interesting. But I just wanted to sort of, this is my penultimate section, this is again those same dioramas, but now instead of focusing on this, realize there is not actually a Native American here, but there could be, realize that as the landscape was changing, you had people out there perceiving the landscape, and their ways of perceiving the landscape were changing, right? So, in each of these, there's the person, there's actually here, I'm going to pretend there's a hunter hanging out over here. There's an artist painting a picture. Here are people logging. So, but the point I wanted to make was that, really talking about ecological change is not only how the landscape changes, it's how our perception of the landscape changes. And I wanted to just sort of finish off a little bit with asking you to think about this a little bit to yourself, and then we can go through some of it. But how do you think 19th century people differed in their interactions with and perceptions of nature? How are they using the land or interacting with the land? And how would that influence how they perceived it? Understand the question I'm asking?
You mean different from us? Or
different from us. Different from us. It would have been different amongst them too, but yeah.
I mean, it could go from more of a toiling aspect to enjoyment aspect, right?
Okay, so they were working in the land, so, and that in some ways that could be thinking, oh, it's just drudgery, but at the same time, if 19th century farming, you didn't have all the agrochemicals and heavy equipment you do today to make everything uniform. So you had to really know that land. I mean, each farm was very different. So that sort of a relationship means you really have to, I think in ways that we don't even, are barely conscious of, you have to look at that land. What other ways would they,
Imagine that 150 years or so ago, people were more likely to think that the resources are inexhaustible.
Okay, yeah. So in some ways, their view of the future. And we've gotten to the future, we've gotten to their future and know that, well, it doesn't quite pan out that way. But yeah, so it could be their view of the future. What else might be a...
Short-term versus long-term thinking.
So short-term, long-term what? Thinking, okay. Yeah, I mean, if you just got to feed yourself, you can't sort of think of necessarily your children's children. Although, I put in here, this would be most dramatic if we really talked about the Native American point of view, and I just don't feel qualified to do that. So I want to acknowledge that, and I think there again, because they might have had a different perspective on long-term versus short-term thinking.
Well, just respect for the land. Also, I mean, the Native Americans reputedly, took care of the land, and the settlers were indifferent.
I just think the reliance, they relied so heavily on whether they were going to have food for the winter and hay for the cows and whatever they were growing. We tinker with gardens today, but it's not quite the same thing.
No, it's not the... And here are just some of the, and this is not a complete list, but the need to tailor farming very closely to the inequalities. It's amazing how much time people spent looking at the sky. I mean, again, for the agricultural reasons of it, but they were trying to predict the weather, and they couldn't go to their weather reports. So a lot of time spent trying to figure out what weather was coming over the horizon. You read some of these early accounts, a lot of time spent looking for medicine. It was the pharmacy, and you had to figure out how you could make use of it, and sometimes you got it right, and sometimes you didn't. But again, looking at the botany from that perspective. Hunting, people probably relied more on hunting and trapping than we do today, and so they would have a different way, a different knowledge. Hours of direct exposure to nature. So you read these accounts from the 1900s, and what did kids do? They didn't sit in front of their cell phones and their computers. They were out trying to tame wild animals, chipmunks. I don't mean like bears, but I mean they were trying to tame the different types of squirrels and that sort of thing. They were out there. It's not always great because they were out there robbing birds' nests, or they were out there chasing butterflies, but just that whole, how kids were brought up would have changed their perception. So I don't have any grand conclusions with this. I just wanted to say, what you see is what you get. What you see is what you get. In other words, how you see something is almost as important as what is there. And that's just something to think about as you think about history. Yeah.
In studying Puritans and studying colonial times, a lot of the forest was seen as a dark, dangerous place, and what we're doing is civilizing it by taming it, bringing it under the Lord's domain and taking it away from the devil. So, it's kind of a very mixed feelings about the forest.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that the people in the 19th century were all naturalists and conservationists by any means. That's not. I'm just again trying to think about how people have changed. And this is just a smidgen on the future. I showed you this diagram earlier about how this is the era of forest regrowth. This is when you'd have lots of old fields. We're actually out here right now. We're out in the we're out where forest has about gotten to be as much forest probably as we're going to get. It may even be declining a bit now because of development. You've had all this regrowth after agricultural abandonment. And so the question it's my last talk slide, and then I have thank you. Are old fields passé? By which I mean, this is an example. This is a modern house here in the county. It has an old field in front, but now these fields are being maintained more for landscaping. Are they really old fields? They're not necessarily old fields in the sense we've been talking about them as just what grew back after agriculture, but they're in some ways almost landscape meadows when they're in this condition. We don't have as many of these old fields arising now because we don't have as much former farmland going back into old fields. So that's all I've got to say. Thanks. Other than saying thank you, thanks for inviting us. Everybody, you all recognize our friend here? No. Weasel, the short-tailed weasel. That picture was taken up on Harvey Mountain. This little weasel was, do you know one of those trails? There's a stone wall that crosses it. And it just came out and barked at us. We were walking by, and it would go back into the stone wall and then poke its head up somewhere else. And so we got some good fun. Anybody have any questions for Claudia and I?
You didn't mention fungi in the various organisms, and I wondered what...
We just hired a fungal researcher a couple of years ago.
After this,
so we did not have the expertise when we did the book. We were blind. Well, we weren't blind to fungi, but we just didn't know enough to attack them in any serious way. So yeah, very little on fungi in there.
Yeah.
The addendum can be mushrooms. Yeah.
Do you have information about how the bird population has changed during this time frame? When we talk to some of our older residents and they talk about, there used to be flocks of grosbeaks who we don't see, or goldfinches who we may see fewer of. And I don't know if that's a climate change thing because it's warmer and they're going further north, or is it something to do with the succession?
I think it's all of the above. So, there used to be passenger pigeons in Columbia County. There are records of them. So you have certain birds that disappeared for the reasons that they went extinct. You definitely have birds that come and go based on the habitat. So examples are, what bobolink are and meadowlark, the grassland birds. So late 1800s was the great time for the grassland birds because you had grass everywhere. It was grass-based agriculture. You had hayfields. The hayfields were being cut maybe just once a year. In late July, August, it was great for them. A little bit later, as you get into the abandonment era and you get young forest, you have more things like ruffed grouse because they like the popple, the aspen. And then then as the forests mature, those other things fade out because the landscape has changed. And then you've got climate change, which maybe we don't see as many snow buntings or whatever as we used to. But what's the bird that's waking you up these days? I don't know if any of you noticed the Carolina wren.
Yes, those are doing just the last couple of years.
Yeah, those have come in and taken, so they're coming north. And people don't realize, the cardinal only came into the county in the 1900s, early 1900s. It wasn't always here. There were some great references. It was Eaton, I think was his name. Birds of New York, published 1914 or so. And what's really interesting about that book is that they had informers in each town in the county, each county in the state, talking about the birds that were breeding. And so there was somebody at least one person in Columbia County reporting who the birds were that were breeding, and you can find those tables in his report. So definitely, large changes. Net, I don't know, but yes, all over the place.
And another helpful resource is the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas.
Yeah, and then there's the breeding bird surveys, which have been going on since the 60s, mid-60s, I think, something like that. The national ones, where they have routes that they take. So there are some, as you get up into more recent times, there are definitely some resources out there.
And
there's one going on now for asking about to document and do a survey on the birds in your bird feeder, particularly.
Yeah.
So that's from Cornell.
Yeah. Fun things like eBird now and iNaturalist. Amazing tools up there. Yeah.
Well, Cornell has a free app, Merlin.
Merlin, yeah.
Merlin, that's
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, no, that is, and they're trying to get similar technology for listening to frogs and similar technology for listening to the insects. I mean, when we go out there today, I can almost guarantee you, you're going to hear lots of insects. I won't know what they all are, but those fields are really alive with insects, singing insects.
You know, right now, we haven't gotten any ticks in weeks.
But we won't make any guarantees.
But it's not peak tick season right now.
At least not where we've been.
Peak is October?
Yeah.
No, I was.
Sometimes like in February, March, it gets really bad. So, yeah, I haven't figured it out.
Sorry?
No, there was at one aerial photo which showed the increase in ponds and lakes and so on.
Yeah.
When we came here 55 years ago, there were no Canadian geese. None at all. They went away in the winter. But with the increase in water, you've got many more water birds.
Yeah, the pond boom is sort of this mixed bag. Because as you say, yes, it can provide habitat for some species like water, ducks and geese and things like that. What often happens, though, is that these ponds are put into wetlands. So you're taking sort of a rich native wetland and converting it into an open pond, which really wasn't a common habitat around here. You get it after like beaver, you get beaver ponds, but they wouldn't last for a long. And if people furthermore put like largemouth bass and grass carp, so you put grass carp in there to eat all the vegetation, and you put largemouth bass in there because maybe you want to fish or you feel it's something important. And you're essentially, by taking out all the vegetation with the grass carp, you're sort of turning a forest into a parking lot, and then you're letting whatever antelope are out there, you're letting leopards go by putting in the largemouth bass. And so, really, areas like that can be relative to the native wetland that likely came before, cannot be so good ecologically. So it's not, it's not a complete black and white. If you put it into an upland area that was just a hayfield, yeah, you've lost a bit of hayfield, but maybe you've net added some aquatic habitat. But if you're putting it into a low area that was a wet meadow, then maybe not so good.
Do you have a sense of whether these ponds are for recreation or fire ponds?
I think it's all, initially, I shouldn't, there were ponds that were put in back in the 1800s for agriculture. People wanted cattle ponds, irrigation ponds. So there was a level, and the other thing was mill ponds. Those were along creeks, but those were true ponds. So you did have some pondification in the 1800s. You probably had a fair number of ponds prior to that. Why? Who was making the ponds in the 1500s?
Beavers.
Beaver, yeah. So you had but it's a different kind of pond. That's right. The thing. So I think modern, yes, there's fire insurance. That's part of it, for sure. But I think you also, if you look at the real estate pages, I sometimes do this. You'll see these advertisements, and they quite regularly will say like, beautiful pond and house. So it's sort of, I think perhaps part of what happened is people, because you did have some ponds on farms, people associated that with the agrarian ideal. And then if you want to have a country house, well, you should have a pond. And then people like to swim, people like to fish, and I like to swim. So I think there's a variety of different reasons. Yeah. Great. Thanks.